In a quiet house where nothing ever seemed to change, one room had been kept exactly as it was for decades. Its furniture unmoved, its curtains drawn by habit rather than need. No one questioned it. No one entered without reason. Until one small disturbance revealed that silence itself had been carefully arranged, and that the past had been waiting patiently to be noticed. Chapter 1. The room that never changed. The house stood at the end of Elderwood Lane where the pavement softened into gravel, and the sound of passing footsteps seemed to fade before reaching its gate. It was a Victorian house in the strictest sense. Tall, narrow windows. Dark brick softened by age. A roof that sloped gently, like a resting shoulder. Nothing about it invited attention. Nothing about it appeared neglected. It existed in a state of careful continuation, as though every year had been politely acknowledged, and then dismissed. Inside the house, the air carried a particular stillness. Not silence, but a steadiness that came from long habit. Floors creaked in the same places they always had. Doors closed with familiar restraint. Even the ticking of the hall clock seemed to understand its role and never hurried. There were rooms used daily. The sitting room with its comfortable chairs and predictable conversations. The dining room with its polished table and careful portions. The kitchen warm and practical, and filled with the faint scent of tea. And then there was the Victorian Room. It was spoken of rarely, and never directly, not because it was forbidden, but because it had settled into something less obvious than rules. It had become custom. The Victorian Room lay at the back of the house on the first floor. Its door faced the narrow staircase landing. The handle was polished from use, yet no one could recall the last time they had seen the door opened for more than a few moments. It was cleaned regularly, dusted carefully. Its curtains were drawn and opened according to the same schedule that had been followed for decades. At precisely 9 each morning, the curtains were opened. At precisely 4 each afternoon, they were closed. No one questioned this. It was simply done. Miss Eleanor Harcourt had lived in the house longer than anyone else. She had arrived as a young woman to assist her widowed cousin, and had never quite left. Time had rearranged many things, but not her position. She moved through the house with quiet confidence. Observant. Polite. Rarely surprised. On this particular morning, she climbed the staircase as she always did. Her hand rested lightly on the banister. Her pace was unhurried. She paused at the landing just long enough to notice something that did not belong. The Victorian Room door was closed as expected. The handle was cool beneath her fingers when she tested it gently out of habit. Locked as usual. But something else caught her attention. The curtains inside the room were not fully drawn. It was a small thing. So small that many would have dismissed it as imagination. But Miss Harcourt did not rely on imagination. She relied on pattern. The right curtain hung perhaps an inch lower than it should have. The gap was narrow, barely noticeable. Yet it allowed a thin blade of morning light to touch the inner edge of the window frame. Miss Harcourt stood very still. She had opened and closed those curtains herself for many years. She knew the weight of the fabric, the way it fell, the precise point at which it rested. This was different. She did not act immediately. She never did. Instead, she allowed the observation to settle. She examined it quietly, as though it were a thought, rather than a fact. Someone had been in the room, or something had been moved. She withdrew her hand from the door handle and continued down the stairs without altering her expression. Breakfast proceeded as normal. The clink of cups, the polite exchange of remarks about the weather. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lane, moved efficiently between rooms. Mr. Arthur Bell, the current owner of the house, read his paper with familiar absorption. No one mentioned the Victorian Room. Yet Miss Harcourt watched them carefully. Mrs. Lane passed the foot of the stairs without glancing upward. Mr. Bell folded his paper with an absent air. Neither showed any sign of awareness. Either they truly did not know, or they were pretending not to. After breakfast, Miss Harcourt returned upstairs under the quiet excuse of airing the linen cupboard. She paused again at the landing. The curtain gap remained. She listened. The house was very still. The Victorian room had always been a place of preservation rather than memory. It held furniture arranged exactly as it had been when the original mistress of the house passed away. A writing desk. A straight-back chair. A narrow bed with an embroidered coverlet. A mirror that reflected the room with an almost excessive clarity. The room was not sentimental. It was careful. Miss Harcourt had once suggested that the room be repurposed. The suggestion had been received politely and dismissed immediately. Not with argument, with discomfort. That had been many years ago. She reached out again, and this time turned the handle fully. The lock yielded easily. It always had. The door opened a fraction. The air inside the room was cooler. Still. Preserved. Miss Harcourt did not enter. She did not need to. From the threshold, she could see enough. The chair beside the writing desk had been moved. Only slightly. Perhaps no more than a few inches. But it was angled now toward the window, rather than straight ahead. Miss Harcourt closed the door quietly and stepped back. The Victorian room had changed. And the house had not noticed. Miss Harcourt carried the knowledge with her throughout the morning, as though it were a delicate object she did not wish to drop. She moved through the house in her usual way. She commented on the weather. She asked after the gardener. She accepted a cup of tea and thanked Mrs. Lane with genuine warmth. Nothing outward had shifted, yet something unseen had already begun to rearrange itself. The Victorian room had never been a place of secrecy. That was the curious thing. Anyone could enter it. Anyone could look upon its contents. And yet, no one truly did. It existed beyond interest, beyond question. That was why its alteration mattered. After luncheon, Mr. Arthur Bell suggested a short walk. He was a man of routine, and his habits rarely varied. Miss Harcourt agreed readily. She always preferred observation to interrogation. As they walked the gravel path that led toward the village green, she allowed the conversation to drift naturally. She spoke of flowers, of the changing season, of the quietness of the house. "It does feel rather settled these days," Mr. Bell said. "Almost too settled." Miss Harcourt smiled faintly. "Some places settle so deeply that they resist being stirred." Mr. Bell nodded, though his expression tightened slightly. "The house has always been that way. Always," Miss Harcourt repeated gently. They walked on. The hedges whispered softly in the breeze. Children's voices drifted faintly from beyond the green. "Do you recall the Victorian room when you were a child?" Miss Harcourt asked without looking at him. Mr. Bell hesitated. It was brief but unmistakable. "Yes," he said. "Of course. What do you recall most clearly?" she asked. He considered. The way it looked. Exactly the same. It never changed. Miss Harcourt inclined her head. "And the chair by the desk?" "Yes. Where was it positioned?" There was another pause. Longer this time. "Beside the desk," he said. Facing forward, Miss Harcourt said nothing. They returned to the house shortly after. Mr. Bell excused himself to attend to correspondence. Mrs. Lane retreated to the kitchen. The house resumed its quiet rhythm. Miss Harcourt waited. At precisely 4 in the afternoon, she climbed the stairs once more. As always, she reached for the curtain cord. And stopped. The curtains were already closed. Completely. Perfectly. She stood very still. Mrs. Lane did not usually perform this task early. She was precise, methodical. She prided herself on routine. Miss Harcourt turned slowly and descended the stairs. "Mrs. Lane," she said calmly, "did you close the curtains in the Victorian room early today?" Mrs. Lane looked up from her work. Her expression was puzzled. "No, miss," she said. "I was waiting for the hour." Miss Harcourt nodded. "Thank you." She returned upstairs without haste. She opened the door fully this time. The Victorian room greeted her in its familiar quiet. The air was unchanged. The furniture, unchanged. Almost. The chair had been returned to its original position, but something else had moved. On the writing desk lay a small object that had not been there before. A folded piece of paper. Miss Harcourt approached slowly. She did not touch it immediately. She examined the room as a whole, the mirror, the bed, the window. Nothing else appeared disturbed. She unfolded the paper carefully. It was blank. No writing, no mark, no sign of age. Yet the paper itself was new. Miss Harcourt folded it again and placed it back on the desk exactly where she had found it. She stepped backward and closed the door. The Victorian room had been entered twice. Once to disturb, once to correct, and whoever had done so wanted the room to appear unchanged. Miss Harcourt descended the stairs with calm certainty. The mystery had not announced itself. It had simply taken a seat. Chapter 2. Objects that remember too much. The next morning arrived with a pale winter light that seemed to skim the rooftops rather than settle on them. The house woke in its usual order. The kettle first. The hall clock second. Footsteps after. Miss Eleanor Harcourt listened to these small sounds with the attention of someone who knew that certainty was often made from repetition. She did not speak of the folded paper at breakfast. She did not mention the curtains. She did not ask whether anyone had climbed the stairs in the late afternoon. She understood that the most careful secrets were rarely protected by force. They were protected by manners. Mr. Arthur Bell read his newspaper again with a faint frown that appeared and disappeared like a passing cloud. Mrs. Lane moved briskly between the kitchen and the dining room carrying toast and marmalade, and the quiet comfort of routine. The gardener's boy came to the back door with a basket of kindling and left without lingering. Nothing sounded like guilt. That was what troubled Miss Harcourt. When something wrong occurred in a close house, the house itself often shifted. A voice became too bright. A hand became too careful. A glance became too quick. But here everything remained smooth. After breakfast, Miss Harcourt climbed the stairs at a time that did not belong to the schedule. She waited until the landing was empty, and the corridor below was silent. She approached the Victorian room door with calm purpose. The handle was cool. The lock turned easily. Inside the room, the air was still, not stale, not dusty, simply held in place. The curtains were open now, as expected. Morning light lay across the writing desk like a thin cloth. The folded paper remained where it had been. Miss Harcourt did not touch it. She did not need to touch it again. The fact of its presence was enough. A new object in an old room was not only an intrusion, it was a message. Even if it carried no words. She stepped in fully and closed the door behind her. The sound was soft. The room accepted it without complaint. She began as she always began, with what could be measured. The chair beside the desk. It sat in its correct position now. Miss Harcourt walked around it slowly and looked down at the carpet. The rug was old but well kept. Its pattern had faded into gentle roses and curling leaves. Beneath the chair legs there were faint marks. Not scratches. Not damage. Pressed impressions in the pile of the rug. The chair had been moved and returned. That meant the person who moved it cared enough to correct their mistake, or feared the consequences of leaving it wrong. Miss Harcourt shifted her gaze to the desk. The desk had been polished so many times that the wood seemed to hold a soft shine even in shadow. A small inkstand sat at the top right, a decorative blotter beside it. A letter opener placed neatly as though waiting to be used. Miss Harcourt looked at the letter opener for longer than was necessary. It was positioned with its handle angled slightly toward the right side of the desk. Yet the original mistress of this room had been left-handed. Miss Harcourt knew this. She had been told long ago by someone who spoke of the past as though it were a delicate heirloom. If the desk had been preserved exactly as it once was, the letter opener would have been angled left. It had been wrong for years, perhaps. or it had been changed recently. The detail was small, yet it carried weight. She moved to the mirror. It stood opposite the window. Tall, framed in dark wood. Its glass was clear and rather unforgiving. It reflected the room with strict accuracy. Miss Harcourt leaned slightly and studied what the mirror showed that her eyes did not. In the reflection, the bed coverlet seemed smooth. The pillow sat centered. The curtain tiebacks rested evenly. Yet in the lower left of the reflection, she noticed something that did not belong to symmetry. A faint line of dust along the baseboard behind the bedside table. It was not heavy. It was not careless. It was simply there. As though the table had been moved outward and pushed back again, leaving a trace that cleaning did not erase. Miss Harcourt walked to the bedside table and looked behind it. The wall there carried a tiny scuff mark. Almost nothing. A pale blur on old paint, the kind of mark that could have been there for years. The kind of mark that could also have appeared yesterday. She crouched slowly. Her knees did not like sudden movement. She was careful. She examined the floor. There was no hidden trap, no secret compartment, no romantic gesture of mystery. Just a simple thing. A small brass ring fixed into the side of the table. Decorative, perhaps. Or practical. Miss Harcourt touched the ring lightly. It did not move. Yet the ring was warmer than the wood around it. That could have been imagination. Or it could have been that someone had touched it not long ago. She stood again and returned to the writing desk. The paper sat there. Blank. Innocent. Provocative. She stared at it for a moment and pictured the person who placed it. The person might have stood where she stood now. Might have looked at the mirror. Might have listened for footsteps on the stairs. A blank paper could mean many things. A warning. A promise. A reminder. Or a test. Miss Harcourt stepped away from the desk and looked around the room as a whole. Rooms carried stories, not in the loud way people imagined, not with ghosts or dramatic scenes. Rooms carried stories through their objects, and through the way those objects shaped behavior. This room had shaped behavior for decades. She opened the wardrobe. Inside were dresses wrapped in protective cloth, their shapes held by time, their colors muted by age. Lavender sachets rested between hangers. Miss Harcourt inhaled. The scent was faint, not strong enough to be recently refreshed. At the bottom of the wardrobe stood a pair of boots. They were polished. Too polished for something that was not worn. Their toe caps reflected a dull light. Miss Harcourt looked at the soles. There was dust. Fine, even, undisturbed. She closed the wardrobe. So whoever came did not dress up as the past. They did not rummage for costume. They came for something else. She returned to the door and opened it quietly. The corridor beyond was empty. The hush of the house continued. As she stepped out, she heard a sound from below. A door closing. Soft voices. Then silence again. Miss Harcourt descended the stairs and paused near the drawing room. The drawing room door was half open. Mr. Arthur Bell's voice drifted out. Calm. Polite. Yes, yes, of course, he said. I understand. Another voice answered. Male. Younger. Controlled in tone. I only wish to be sure, the voice said. Miss Harcourt remained still. She did not intend to eavesdrop. Yet the house had offered her this moment, and she accepted it. Mr. Bell spoke again. There is no need to disturb anything, the younger voice replied. It has already been disturbed. A pause followed. Then Mr. Bell said quietly, Not if we are careful. Miss Harcourt stepped back before she could be noticed. She moved to the hallway table and pretended to examine the mail. The drawing room door opened wider. A young man emerged. He carried a hat in his hands as though he did not trust himself to place it on his head. He was neat, clean-shaven, dressed in a modest coat that suggested work rather than leisure. He stopped when he saw Miss Harcourt. His expression shifted into polite surprise. Miss Harcourt, he said. She smiled gently. Good morning. You are Mr. Thomas Avery, are you not? He blinked. Yes, I did not expect you to remember. It is easier to remember people when they notice things, Miss Harcourt said. Mr. Avery's gaze flickered toward the stairs. A quick glance, a small betrayal. Mr. Bell appeared behind him. Eleanor, I was just speaking with Mr. Avery about some matters in the village. How pleasant, Miss Harcourt said. Mr. Avery cleared his throat. I should go, sir. Mr. Bell nodded. Yes. Thank you for coming. Mr. Avery looked at Miss Harcourt again. His mouth opened as though he wished to say something else. Then he did not. He left. Miss Harcourt watched the door close behind him. Then she turned to Mr. Bell. Is Mr. Avery concerned about the Victorian Room? She asked in the same tone she might have used to ask about the garden roses. Mr. Bell's face held a careful blankness. Why would you ask that? Miss Harcourt did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him with steady calm. After a moment, Mr. Bell said, We have no reason to speak of that room. Yet you just did, Miss Harcourt replied softly. Mr. Bell's eyes narrowed. Not in anger. In thought. In discomfort. I do not know what you mean, he said. Miss Harcourt nodded. Then perhaps you should not try so hard to sound certain. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the hallway with the mail and the quiet ticking clock. Upstairs, the Victorian Room waited with its blank paper and its furniture arranged like a performance that had forgotten its audience. And Miss Harcourt understood one thing with sudden clarity. The room was not only preserving the past, it was controlling the present. That afternoon, Miss Harcourt chose a seat in the sitting room where she could see the staircase through the open doorway. She had learned long ago that people behaved differently when they believed they were unseen. Their true habits stepped forward. Their real pace emerged. Mrs. Lane busied herself in the kitchen. Mr. Bell remained in the drawing room for much of the day, with papers spread like thin wings across the desk. The house moved quietly around him. At 3:30, the village post arrived, a small delivery of letters and parcels carried in by the gardener's boy. Mrs. Lane placed the items on the hallway table with careful order. Miss Harcourt watched without appearing to. Mr. Bell came out of the drawing room. He sorted the mail with a hand that looked steady. He opened one letter, read it quickly, then folded it again and placed it into his pocket. He did not notice that Miss Harcourt had noticed. At 4 precisely, the clock struck. The sound echoed softly through the hall. Mrs. Lane emerged with the key ring in her hand. I will do the curtains now, she said. Miss Harcourt rose as well. I will come with you. Mrs. Lane hesitated. You need not trouble yourself, miss. It is no trouble, Miss Harcourt said. They climbed the stairs together. Mrs. Lane moved with firm steps and a sense of duty. She stopped at the Victorian Room door and inserted the key with practiced ease. She opened the door and stepped inside without looking around. She went directly to the curtains. This alone interested Miss Harcourt. People who entered a room usually glanced at it, even briefly. Yet Mrs. Lane looked only at what she intended to change. It was a habit of avoidance. Mrs. Lane drew the curtains closed. She tied them neatly. Then she turned toward the door. Miss Harcourt stepped into the room. Mrs. Lane froze. Miss, she said quietly, we do not usually linger. Miss Harcourt looked around. Everything appeared correct. The chair, the desk, the bed, the mirror. Yet she saw something new. The paper on the desk was gone. Miss Harcourt walked toward the desk slowly. Mrs. Lane, she said, did you move something from the desk? Mrs. Lane's face tightened. No, Miss Harcourt studied her. Mrs. Lane was not a woman given to lies. She might omit. She might avoid. But she did not invent easily. Miss Harcourt reached for the inkstand. It sat heavy. Solid. She lifted it slightly and replaced it. The surface beneath was clean. Then she ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the desk. A faint ridge of paper dust clung there, as though paper had been slid away quickly, or removed and hidden. Miss Harcourt turned to Mrs. Lane. Who else has a key? She asked. Mrs. Lane swallowed. Mr. Bell, of course. And before him, Mrs. Lane hesitated. The solicitor once held a key. For estate matters. Mr. Avery, Miss Harcourt said. Mrs. Lane looked startled. Mr. Avery is only a clerk. Clerks carry more than papers, Miss Harcourt replied. Mrs. Lane turned her gaze to the floor. Miss Harcourt, people do not wish that room disturbed. It has already been disturbed, Miss Harcourt said gently. Mrs. Lane's hands twisted together. It brings trouble when people begin to look at it. Miss Harcourt's voice remained calm. Trouble often exists long before anyone looks. Mrs. Lane's eyes flicked to the bedside table. Miss Harcourt followed the glance. Why do you look there? Miss Harcourt asked. Mrs. Lane shook her head quickly. No reason. Miss Harcourt walked toward the bedside table. She did not touch it yet. She simply stood beside it and examined it with quiet attention. The brass ring on its side caught a sliver of light even through the curtains. It was such a small feature. Yet it seemed out of place in a room where everything else was chosen for appearance. Miss Harcourt turned the table slightly, only a fraction. A soft scraping sound came from beneath. Mrs. Lane inhaled sharply. Miss Harcourt crouched and looked under the table. There was a small wooden panel, flush with the underside, almost invisible unless one looked for it. She reached for the brass ring again and pulled. The panel loosened with a soft click. Inside the hollow space lay a narrow leather case. Miss Harcourt did not open it yet. She looked at Mrs. Lane. How long has that been there? Mrs. Lane's eyes filled with fear. That was not dramatic, not theatrical. It was the fear of a woman who had carried weight for too long. I did not know, Mrs. Lane whispered. I swear I did not know. Miss Harcourt held the case in her palm. It felt light, too light for coins, too light for jewelry. She opened it carefully. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was old, the edges brittle, the handwriting small and neat. Miss Harcourt did not read them yet. She only looked at the first page. At the top was a name, Clara Harcourt. Miss Harcourt's hand stilled. For a moment, the room felt colder. Clara Harcourt had been the original mistress of this house, a woman spoken of in quiet tones, a woman whose belongings were preserved as though she might return, a woman whose death was described as peaceful and private. Miss Harcourt had never questioned that story. Now the letters existed like a pulse beneath the polished surface of the house. Mrs. Lane's voice trembled. Please, Miss. Put them back. Miss Harcourt looked at her gently. Why? Mrs. Lane's eyes darted toward the door. Because Mr. Bell will not forgive it. Miss Harcourt straightened slowly. Does Mr. Bell know? Mrs. Lane whispered, he knows there were letters. Not where, not how many. He knows enough to be frightened. Miss Harcourt held the bundle with steady hands. Who placed the blank paper on the desk? Mrs. Lane shook her head. I do not know. Miss Harcourt studied her again. But you suspect. Mrs. Lane's lips pressed together. Then she said quietly, Mr. Avery has been asking questions. He is always polite, always careful. But he asks. He asks about dates, about keys, about who enters rooms. Miss Harcourt nodded slowly. And Mr. Bell asked him not to disturb anything. Mrs. Lane looked down. Miss Harcourt returned her gaze to the letters. She felt no excitement, no thrill. Only the calm sorrow of someone realizing that a long silence had been manufactured. She placed the letters back into the leather case. She did not close the panel yet. Mrs. Lane, she said, who told you to close the curtains at 4 every day? Mrs. Lane replied as if reciting a rule learned in childhood. It was in my instructions when I came. From Mr. Bell's mother. She said the room must be kept as it was. She said light must not fade the fabrics. She said the room was to be respected. And you obeyed, Miss Harcourt said. Yes, Miss Harcourt asked, did anyone ever explain why? Mrs. Lane's face tightened. They said it was grief. Miss Harcourt nodded. Grief is often used to cover other things. She closed the hidden panel gently and turned the bedside table back into place. Then she took the leather case with her. Mrs. Lane made a small sound of protest. Miss Harcourt looked at her kindly. I will not destroy them. I will not spread them like gossip. But I will not leave them here to be moved by hands that fear the truth. Mrs. Lane whispered, Mr. Bell will be angry. Miss Harcourt's voice remained soft. Mr. Bell is already angry. He is simply directing it towards silence. They left the room together and locked the door behind them. On the landing, Miss Harcourt paused and listened. From below came the sound of a door opening. Mr. Bell calling quietly for Mrs. Lane. Mrs. Lane looked at Miss Harcourt with pleading eyes. Miss Harcourt nodded once. Go, she said. Mrs. Lane hurried down the stairs. Miss Harcourt remained on the landing. In her hand, the leather case felt like a small heart. Downstairs, Mr. Bell's voice rose slightly. Not shouting, not cruelty, but strain. Where have you been? He asked. Mrs. Lane answered with careful respect. I was closing the curtains, sir. Mr. Bell replied. You took too long. Miss Harcourt closed her eyes for a brief moment. A room that never changed had begun to move. Not by accident, by design. And the design had begun to fail. Because objects remembered too much. And people, no matter how polite, could not control what a room was finally ready to reveal. Chapter 3. The Habit of Silence. The house did not react immediately to the knowledge Miss Eleanor Harcourt carried upstairs with her. It rarely did. Houses that had practiced silence for long enough learned how to absorb disturbance without showing it. The walls remained steady. The stairs did not creak any louder than usual. The clock continued its patient marking of time as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Yet Miss Harcourt felt the difference. She sat in her small bedroom with the leather case resting on the table beside her. The curtains were open just enough to admit the pale afternoon light. Outside, the sky was the color of watered milk, and the air seemed heavy with restraint. She did not open the case again at once. That was not her way. She understood that once words were read, they could not be unread. Their weight settled permanently. She preferred to let facts breathe before examining them too closely. Downstairs, voices moved carefully through the house. Mrs. Lane spoke with measured calm. Mr. Bell's replies were polite, but clipped. Their exchange had the sound of people circling something they would not name. Miss Harcourt listened without pressing her ear to the floor or the door. She listened with her attention, rather than her body. It was a skill she had learned early in life, the ability to hear not what was said but what was avoided. Later that afternoon, Mr. Bell knocked at her door. It was a soft knock. Considerate. Controlled. Eleanor, he said through the wood, may I speak with you? Yes, she replied at once. He entered and closed the door behind him with care. He stood for a moment as though adjusting himself to the room. His eyes flicked briefly to the table where the leather case lay. He did not comment. You seem occupied, he said. Only thoughtful, Miss Harcourt replied. He nodded. I hope nothing in the house has unsettled you. Miss Harcourt looked at him gently. Has something unsettled you? His lips pressed together. I have always believed that peace is maintained by discretion. Peace is often mistaken for quiet, Miss Harcourt said. He sighed and sat in the chair opposite her. You have lived here long enough to know that the Victorian Room holds memories best left undisturbed. It holds letters, Miss Harcourt replied calmly. The air shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. Mr. Bell did not ask how she knew. He did not ask where they were. He leaned back slightly and folded his hands. Those letters, he said slowly, belong to the past. They belong to a woman, Miss Harcourt replied. Mr. Bell closed his eyes briefly. Clara was my mother. Miss Harcourt nodded. And your mother was not as silent as the room suggests. He opened his eyes and looked at her with something close to pleading. She was unhappy. She wrote often. She imagined betrayals where there were none. Miss Harcourt said nothing. That room, he continued, was preserved out of respect, not concealment. Miss Harcourt allowed the silence to lengthen. Then she said, "If that were true, you would not be afraid of the letters." His jaw tightened. "You are assuming fear." "I am observing it," she replied. Mr. Bell stood and walked to the window. He did not look out. He looked at the glass as though it were a barrier rather than a view. "There are habits in families," he said. "They form quietly. They harden. They become structure." "Yes," Miss Harcourt agreed. "And when they are not examined, they become prisons." He turned to face her. "What do you intend to do?" She met his gaze without challenge. "I intend to understand why a room was turned into a performance." He shook his head. "You will cause harm." "I will cause change," she replied. He exhaled slowly. "You do not understand what it would mean if those letters were known." Miss Harcourt replied, "I understand what it has meant to keep them hidden." He looked away. After he left, Miss Harcourt sat alone again. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel victorious. She felt only the steady weight of inevitability. That evening, she descended to the sitting room and found Mrs. Lane arranging cushions with unnecessary precision. "Mrs. Lane," Miss Harcourt said gently, "may I ask you something?" "Yes, miss. How long have you lived with the Victorian Room?" Mrs. Lane's hands paused. "Since I came to this house. Nearly 20 years. And before that, my mother worked here before me." Miss Harcourt nodded. "Did she ever speak of it?" Mrs. Lane hesitated. "She said it was easier to obey than to ask." Miss Harcourt smiled faintly. "That is how habits survive." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the sky darkened. That night, Miss Harcourt finally opened the leather case. She read slowly, carefully. Each letter was written in Clara Harcourt's neat hand. They spoke of loneliness, of doubt, of careful observations that others had dismissed, of a growing certainty that something was wrong within her own house. Not madness, not hysteria, awareness. Miss Harcourt closed the case after reading only a few. She did not need to read them all to understand the truth. Clara Harcourt had not been mistaken. She had been inconvenient, and the Victorian Room had been arranged to preserve not her memory, but her silence. The following morning arrived with a heaviness that lingered even after the sun rose. The house woke more slowly. Mrs. Lane moved with less assurance. Mr. Bell remained behind his closed door longer than usual. Miss Harcourt took her tea alone. She did not bring the letters downstairs. She did not confront anyone with them. She allowed the knowledge to exist as a presence rather than a weapon. It was mid-morning when Mr. Thomas Avery returned. Miss Harcourt observed his arrival from the window at the top of the stairs. He walked up the path with measured steps. He paused before knocking as though preparing himself. When Mr. Bell answered the door, Miss Harcourt descended the stairs quietly and remained just out of sight. Their voices reached her clearly. "I told you this was not necessary," Mr. Bell said. Mr. Avery replied calmly, "It became necessary when things began to move." "They were not meant to move." "They already have," Mr. Avery said. A pause followed. "You have been in the room," Mr. Bell said. "Yes," Mr. Avery replied without denial. "You had no right." "I had responsibility," Mr. Avery said. "As the solicitor's clerk. As someone who read the estate papers." Mr. Bell's voice hardened. "Those papers were settled years ago." "They were settled with omissions," Mr. Avery replied. Miss Harcourt stepped into view then. "Good morning," she said. Both men turned. Mr. Avery's eyes widened slightly. Mr. Bell stiffened. Miss Harcourt addressed Mr. Avery first. "You placed the blank paper on the desk." Mr. Avery nodded. "I wanted to see if it would be noticed." "And it was," Miss Harcourt said. "Yes," he replied quietly. "By you." She studied him. Why now? He hesitated. Because the house is being sold, Mr. Bell spoke sharply. That is not relevant. It is entirely relevant, Mr. Avery replied. Once the house changes hands, the room loses protection. The letters surface. Or they disappear. Miss Harcourt nodded slowly. You feared they would be destroyed. Yes. And you feared they would be ignored, she added. Mr. Avery looked at her with something close to relief. Exactly. Mr. Bell turned away. You do not understand what you are interfering with. Miss Harcourt replied softly. You are interfering with the truth by pretending it is dangerous. She looked at Mr. Avery. You knew Clara Harcourt's story, he nodded. I read enough to know she was not ill. She was observant, Miss Harcourt said. And you needed someone else to see the disturbance. Yes. Mr. Bell's voice broke. You are turning memory into accusation. Miss Harcourt met his gaze. Memory becomes accusation when it is suppressed. Silence filled the hallway. Mrs. Lane stood at the kitchen door listening with pale face and clenched hands. Miss Harcourt said, The room was never sacred. It was strategic. Mr. Bell closed his eyes. What will you do? Miss Harcourt answered simply, I will speak. To whom? He asked. To the person the room was meant to silence, she replied. He looked at her in confusion. She said quietly, Clara Harcourt is not absent. She is present in every choice made to keep that room unchanged. Mr. Avery inhaled sharply. Miss Harcourt continued. The room taught everyone in this house how to behave, what to avoid, what not to question. It trained silence. Mr. Bell sat heavily on the hall chair. You will ruin us. Miss Harcourt shook her head, gently. Silence already did. She turned to Mr. Avery. The letters will be read. Carefully, privately. They will not be sensationalized, but they will not be hidden. Mr. Avery nodded. Thank you. Mrs. Lane spoke for the first time. Will the room change? Miss Harcourt looked up the stairs. Yes, not dramatically, but truthfully. Later that afternoon, Miss Harcourt returned to the Victorian Room alone. She opened the curtains fully and left them that way. Light filled the space and revealed every careful arrangement, every deliberate placement. She moved the chair and did not return it. She opened the wardrobe and removed the boots. She placed the letters on the desk in plain view. The room did not resist. It had been waiting. Downstairs, the house felt different. Not louder, not lighter. Just honest. Miss Harcourt stood in the doorway and understood that the hardest part was over. Silence had been interrupted. And once broken, it could not be perfectly restored. The Victorian Room had begun to release what it had been trained to contain, and the house would never be arranged the same way again. Chapter 4. A Memory Out of Place. Change entered the house quietly. It did not arrive with raised voices or sudden gestures. It arrived through small disruptions in routine, the kind that unsettled without announcing themselves. Miss Eleanor Harcourt noticed it first, in the way the morning light lingered longer on the staircase. With the Victorian Room curtains now left open, the sunlight traveled further than it had for years. It reached the banister. It touched the faded wallpaper. It revealed marks that had always been there but never examined. The house did not object. It accepted the light as though it had been waiting for it. Breakfast was a restrained affair. Mr. Bell ate little. Mrs. Lane hovered with uncertainty. Mr. Avery did not join them. He had left early with a polite note excusing himself. The absence itself felt deliberate. Miss Harcourt drank her tea slowly and observed. People spoke less when silence lost its authority. Words became heavier, more intentional. Even glances carried weight. After breakfast, Miss Harcourt returned to the Victorian Room. She entered without ceremony. The room felt larger now that its habits had been interrupted. The air moved differently. Less held. More honest. She sat at the writing desk for the first time. The chair was firm, unyielding. Clara Harcourt had not written here in comfort. That realization settled quietly. The desk had not been a refuge. It had been a place of vigilance. Miss Harcourt opened one of the letters and read again with deeper attention. Clara wrote of voices lowering when she entered a room, of conversations stopping too quickly, of doors closing gently, but firmly. She described moments that others would have dismissed as imagination. Yet they formed a pattern. The most troubling letter spoke of a memory Clara could not reconcile. She wrote of an afternoon tea in the sitting room. She described the sunlight, the arrangement of cups, the sound of a carriage outside. She recalled Mr. Bell as a boy standing by the window. But Clara also recalled another presence. A woman seated near the fire, quiet, watching. Clara wrote that everyone else denied the woman had been there. They insisted she had been alone with the children. They said no visitor had come, yet Clara remembered the woman's gloves on the side table. Miss Harcourt lowered the letter slowly. A memory out of place was often the first sign of deception. Not because it was false, but because it did not fit the story others needed to maintain. She rose and walked to the sitting room. Mrs. Lane was there adjusting the curtains. Miss Harcourt watched her movements. The woman hesitated before touching the fabric as though unsure whether the old rules still applied. "You may leave them as they are," Miss Harcourt said. Mrs. Lane nodded gratefully. Miss Harcourt sat in Clara's former chair near the fire. She imagined the afternoon Clara described. The teacups, the light, the tension disguised as civility. "Mrs. Lane," she said gently, "do you remember a woman who visited this house often but was never acknowledged?" Mrs. Lane's hands froze. "I do not know what you mean," she said quickly. Miss Harcourt did not press immediately. She allowed the silence to breathe. Then she said, "She wore gloves indoors." Mrs. Lane swallowed. She was quiet, Miss Harcourt continued. "Observant, not welcome." Mrs. Lane's voice trembled. "There were people who did not fit," Miss Harcourt said. Mrs. Lane nodded once. Mr. Bell's father had a sister. Miss Harcourt felt the room sharpen. "She was not spoken of," Mrs. Lane said. "She was clever. Too clever. She asked questions. What became of her?" Miss Harcourt asked. Mrs. Lane shook her head. "She left," Miss Harcourt said calmly. "Or she was made to disappear." Mrs. Lane covered her mouth. "Miss, please." Miss Harcourt's voice remained gentle. "Silence is not kindness." Mrs. Lane whispered they said she unsettled Clara. Miss Harcourt replied. Clara was unsettled, because she noticed what others wanted hidden. The room seemed to lean closer. Miss Harcourt returned to the Victorian room with the letter still open in her mind. She walked to the wardrobe again and examined the dresses with new understanding. One garment stood out. It was darker, less worn, its sleeves slightly longer than the others. It was not Clara's style. Miss Harcourt lifted it carefully. Inside the pocket she found a handkerchief, plain, with a single embroidered initial. Miss Harcourt folded it slowly. So the woman had existed. She returned to the desk and placed the handkerchief beside the letters. Then she sat again and closed her eyes. The room had not preserved Clara's life. It had preserved a version of her that suited others. That afternoon, Mr. Bell approached the Victorian room for the first time since its change. He stood in the doorway with rigid posture. Miss Harcourt did not rise. "You are rearranging things," he said. "I am restoring proportion," she replied. He looked at the desk, at the letters, at the handkerchief. His face drained of color. "That should not be here," he said. Miss Harcourt looked at him steadily. "It has always been here." He shook his head. "That woman was a mistake." Miss Harcourt replied calmly, "Mistakes do not leave handkerchiefs in wardrobes." He closed his eyes. "You are digging for scandal." "I am uncovering omission," she said. He looked at her then with something close to defeat. You do not know what it costs to keep this house respectable. Miss Harcourt answered softly. I know what it cost, Clara. The room held them both in its quiet honesty. The past had shifted, and memory had found its place. That evening, the house gathered not by intention, but by gravity. The sitting room filled slowly. Mrs. Lane sat near the edge of her chair. Mr. Bell remained standing. Mr. Avery returned at dusk, carrying a thin file under his arm. Miss Harcourt sat near the fire with composed calm. No one spoke at first. Then, Mr. Avery said, I found records. Mr. Bell exhaled sharply. Of course you did. They were not hidden. Mr. Avery replied. They were simply not indexed. Miss Harcourt nodded. That is how truth is often buried. Mr. Avery opened the file. Edith Bell, sister to your father. Declared unsuitable for inheritance. Declared unreliable. Mr. Bell's voice was flat. She was disruptive. She questioned transfers of funds, Mr. Avery said. She questioned decisions made while Clara Harcourt was ill. Miss Harcourt looked at Mr. Bell. Illness is a convenient word. Mr. Bell said nothing. Mr. Avery continued. Edith left the house. Or was sent away. Accounts differ. Mrs. Lane whispered. She cried. Miss Harcourt turned to her gently. Mrs. Lane nodded. She cried when she left. She told my mother that the house was lying. Mr. Bell lowered himself into a chair. Mr. Avery said quietly, Clara wrote to Edith. These letters were never delivered. He produced an envelope. Miss Harcourt accepted it with care. Inside were copies of letters written in Clara's hand. They spoke of confusion, of isolation, of fear. One line stood out. If I am mistaken, then forgive me. But if I am not, then remember me. Miss Harcourt read the line aloud. The room remained silent. Mr. Bell spoke at last. My father did what he believed was necessary. Miss Harcourt replied, belief does not absolve consequence. Mr. Avery added, the estate benefited. Mr. Bell nodded faintly. Yes, Mrs. Lane whispered, and Clara suffered. Mr. Bell covered his face with his hands. Miss Harcourt allowed the moment to settle. Then she said, the room was arranged to keep Clara contained. To suggest peace where there was control, Mr. Bell looked up. You think the room was a warning? Yes, Miss Harcourt said. To everyone else, Mr. Avery said, and to Edith. Miss Harcourt nodded. She was erased because she might speak. Mr. Bell's voice cracked. What do you want? Miss Harcourt replied, acknowledgement. Mr. Avery said, and correction. Mr. Bell stared into the fire. It is too late. Miss Harcourt shook her head gently. It is late. Not too late. That night, Miss Harcourt returned to the Victorian Room one final time before sleep. She sat on the bed and looked at the desk. The letters lay openly now, the handkerchief beside them. She imagined Clara writing, watching, waiting. The room no longer felt oppressive. It felt tired. Miss Harcourt opened the window slightly and allowed fresh air inside. Outside, the night was quiet. Honest. She spoke softly, though no one else was there. You were not wrong, she said. The room accepted the words. And for the first time in many years, it no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a room again. Prepared at last to release what it had been trained to hide. And the house listened. Chapter 5. What the room was hiding. The house entered a different rhythm once the truth had been named aloud. It did not grow louder. It did not grow lighter. It grew deliberate. Each movement seemed chosen rather than assumed. Each silence carried intention rather than avoidance. Miss Eleanor Harcourt noticed it most in the mornings. Mrs. Lane no longer rushed to complete tasks before questions could arise. Mr. Bell no longer lingered behind closed doors. Mr. Avery moved through the house with quiet purpose rather than caution. The Victorian Room remained open. That alone changed everything. Sunlight now crossed the floor and settled beneath the desk. Dust became visible and therefore honest. Objects no longer pretended to be untouched. They simply existed. Miss Harcourt stood near the window one morning and watched Mr. Bell enter the room alone. He moved slowly. His shoulders were tense. He paused before the desk as though approaching an old adversary rather than a piece of furniture. She did not follow him in. Some reckonings required privacy. Downstairs, Mrs. Lane poured tea with careful hands. "He has not been inside since his father died," she said quietly. Miss Harcourt nodded. Rooms remember avoidance. Mrs. Lane hesitated. "Do you think he will change it back?" "No," Miss Harcourt replied. "He no longer can." Upstairs, Mr. Bell sat in the desk chair for the first time. The chair did not welcome him. It was narrow, upright. It demanded posture. He lifted one of the letters with hands that trembled despite his effort to steady them. He read slowly, not skimming, not dismissing. His face shifted as he read. Not with shock, with recognition. The letters did not accuse him directly. They did not need to. They described the world he had grown up in. The careful arrangements. The rehearsed civility. The way decisions were made without explanation. Clara Harcourt had written of fear not of violence but of erasure, of being spoken around rather than to, of being watched and corrected gently until she learned to doubt herself. Mr. Bell closed his eyes. Downstairs, Miss Harcourt and Mr. Avery sat opposite one another. "The estate papers tell a similar story," Mr. Avery said. Funds moved quietly. Authority consolidated. Edith removed. "Removed without scandal," Miss Harcourt replied. "Yes." Mrs. Lane hovered near the doorway. "Mr. Bell's father said it was for the good of the family." Miss Harcourt looked at her gently. Families often define good by convenience. Upstairs, Mr. Bell opened the leather case again. At the bottom lay a folded document he had not yet seen. It was thicker than the letters, more formal. He unfolded it. It was a draft of a will. Clara's will. Mr. Bell's breath caught. The document named Edith Bell as executor. It named provisions that were never enacted. It was unsigned. Mr. Bell understood then what the room had been hiding. Not a crime of passion. Not a dramatic betrayal. A moral theft. Clara had intended to act. She had been prevented. The room preserved her silence, because it preserved the benefit of those who stopped her. Mr. Bell closed the document and sat very still. Downstairs, Miss Harcourt rose. "It is time," she said. "For what?" Mrs. Lane asked. "For the room to tell its whole story." They went upstairs together. Mr. Bell looked up as they entered. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I see it now," he said. Miss Harcourt nodded. "Then you are ready." He gestured toward the desk. "My father believed he was protecting us. He was protecting position," Miss Harcourt replied. Mr. Avery added, "Protection without consent is control." Mr. Bell said quietly, "What must be done?" Miss Harcourt replied, "The letters must be acknowledged. The will must be recorded. Edith must be named." "She is gone," Mr. Bell said. "Names do not disappear when people do," Miss Harcourt replied. Mr. Avery said, "The estate can be amended. The record corrected." Mr. Bell swallowed. "It will reflect badly." Miss Harcourt met his gaze. "It will reflect truthfully." Silence settled again. Not heavy, not defensive, honest. Mr. Bell nodded slowly. "Do it," he said. The room seemed to exhale. Change does not arrive all at once. It unfolds through decisions made quietly and upheld steadily. In the days that followed, the house became a place of careful adjustment. Mr. Avery worked at the dining table with papers spread neatly before him. He drafted letters. He prepared filings. He arranged meetings with solicitors who asked questions and received measured answers. Mrs. Lane watched with unease that softened gradually into relief. "They will talk," she said one evening. "Yes," Miss Harcourt replied. "But they will talk about truth rather than rumor." Upstairs, the Victorian room was no longer cleaned with reverence. It was cleaned with care. Mrs. Lane dusted without fear. She moved objects when necessary. She opened drawers that had never been opened. She found nothing shocking. That itself was revealing. Miss Harcourt spent long hours in the room not as a guardian but as a witness. She sat at the desk. She read the remaining letters. She noticed how Clara's handwriting grew firmer near the end. Not weaker. Firmer. One letter stood apart. It was written after Edith's departure. Clara wrote that the house had grown quieter. Not calmer, quieter. She wrote that silence felt heavier when it was enforced. Miss Harcourt closed the letter and looked around. The room no longer demanded silence. It allowed sound. Footsteps. Pages turning. Breathing. Mr. Bell entered one afternoon carrying a small box. "I found these in storage," he said. Inside were framed photographs. Clara. Edith. A younger Mr. Bell standing stiffly between them. "They were never displayed," he said. Miss Harcourt touched the glass gently, because they contradicted the narrative. He nodded. "Yes." He placed the frames on the desk. "I want them here," he said. Miss Harcourt smiled faintly. That evening the house received visitors. Solicitors. Neighbors. People who remembered Clara kindly but vaguely. The sitting room filled with restrained conversation. Miss Harcourt watched how people reacted when Edith's name was spoken. Some frowned. Some nodded slowly. Some looked away. Memory returned in fragments. "She asked questions," one woman said. "She made people uncomfortable," said another. "Yes," Miss Harcourt replied. "That is often the fate of truth." Mr. Bell stood and addressed the room with measured dignity. "There are things this house kept hidden," he said. "Not to protect love, but to preserve control." No one interrupted. "I will not continue that practice." The room held its breath. Mrs. Lane felt tears slip down her cheeks. Later that night, Miss Harcourt returned to the Victorian Room alone. She sat on the bed and felt the firmness beneath her. She imagined Clara sitting where she sat now. Writing. Waiting. "You were not powerless," Miss Harcourt said softly. "You were restrained." The room no longer resisted her words. Outside the house rested under a clear sky. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. The cost of keeping things untouched had been paid for decades. Now the cost of change would be paid instead. It was not light. It was not easy. But it was honest. And honesty at last had a place to sit. Chapter 6. When the curtains are opened. The day the record was corrected arrived without fanfare. No bells. No public announcement. No dramatic confrontation on the village green. It came in the way most lasting changes came. Through paperwork. Through signatures. Through quiet sentences spoken in rooms where people finally allowed themselves to be truthful. A thin mist hung over Elderwood Lane that morning. It curled along the hedges and softened the edges of the world, as though nature itself had decided to be gentle. The house stood steady behind its gate. It looked no different than it had the week before. Yet inside it, the air felt altered. Not lighter, not brighter. Simply less burdened. Miss Eleanor Harcourt sat in the sitting room, with her hands folded in her lap. A cup of tea cooled slowly on the table beside her. She watched the doorway to the hall where Mr. Arthur Bell paced in measured steps. Not anxious in the manner of a guilty man. Restless in the manner of someone meeting a long-avoided truth. Mr. Thomas Avery arrived precisely at 10 with a leather folder tucked under his arm. He removed his hat as soon as he entered. His expression was composed, yet there was a quiet alertness in his eyes. "It is ready," he said. Mr. Bell stopped pacing. "Will it be enough?" Mr. Avery hesitated. "Enough for the record. Enough for the law. Whether it is enough for the mind is something only time can decide." Mr. Bell nodded and turned toward the stairs. Miss Harcourt rose. I will come. Mr. Bell looked at her, as though weighing whether her presence would make the moment heavier or steadier. After a brief pause, he said, Yes. Please. They climbed together. Mrs. Lane joined them halfway up, her apron still tied, her hands clasped as though she needed to anchor them. She had asked to be present, and Miss Harcourt had agreed without question. Some truths belong not only to those who owned houses, but to those who kept them alive. At the landing, the Victorian Room door stood slightly ajar. It had been left that way since Miss Harcourt began opening it daily. The room was no longer treated as a relic. It was treated as a room. Mr. Bell paused in the doorway. He looked inside as though expecting it to accuse him. But the room did not accuse. It simply existed. Light fell across the desk. The letters were arranged neatly beside the framed photographs. The handkerchief with the embroidered E rested near them, no longer hidden in fabric folds, no longer denied. Mr. Avery placed the folder on the desk and opened it with deliberate calm. The papers inside were crisp and official, yet their meaning was deeply human. This document, he said, amends what was never properly recorded. It acknowledges Edith Bell as executor as Clara intended. It places in the file the draft will and the correspondence that supports it. It also notes that the prior settlement did not reflect Clara's final wishes. Mrs. Lane inhaled sharply. Mr. Bell's face tightened. They will say my father manipulated it. Mr. Avery replied, They will say many things, but the record will not be silent anymore. Miss Harcourt looked at Mr. Bell. It is harder to live with what we do not admit. Mr. Bell's gaze lowered to the paper. His hand hovered above the pen. For a moment, he did not move. In that pause, Miss Harcourt saw what the Victorian Room had done for years. It had trained people to wait for permission, to fear their own decisions, to treat truth as something dangerous. Mr. Bell's hand trembled slightly, then steadied. He signed. The pen scratched softly across the paper. A small sound, yet it felt like an entire chapter of the house turning. Mr. Avery signed next. Then Mrs. Lane surprised them all by stepping forward. I should like to sign, she said quietly. Mr. Bell looked startled. You are not required. Mrs. Lane's voice remained soft but firm. I have lived under that room's rule for 20 years. I would like my name to sit beside the truth as well. Mr. Avery hesitated only a second. Then he turned the page and pointed to a space for witness. Mrs. Lane signed. Her handwriting was careful. Her fingers shook. Yet, the mark remained. Miss Harcourt felt something in her chest ease. Not joy. Not victory. Relief. Because this was how silence ended, not with shouting, with small brave acts. When they finished, Mr. Avery closed the folder. It will go to the solicitor this afternoon, he said. From there, it will be entered properly. Mr. Bell nodded slowly. Then it is done. Miss Harcourt looked around the room. Not done, she corrected gently, but begun. Mr. Bell's eyes moved to the curtains. They hung open. Sunlight warmed the fabric. My mother would have closed them, he said quietly. Miss Harcourt replied, Your mother followed a habit she did not create. And you, he said, turning to her, have broken it. I have interrupted it, Miss Harcourt said. The difference matters. Habits can return. Truth must be chosen each day. Mr. Bell stood very still. I thought if I kept the room untouched, I could keep the past untouched, he said. Miss Harcourt answered, The past is not kept by furniture. It is kept by honesty. They left the room together. Yet Mr. Bell paused at the threshold and turned back once more. His eyes rested on the photograph of Clara and Edith. I never knew her, he said, and Miss Harcourt could not tell whether he meant Clara as she truly was or Edith as she truly was. Mrs. Lane said softly, You knew a story. Mr. Bell nodded as though the words struck with unexpected accuracy. Downstairs, life returned. Lunch preparations. The kettle's familiar hiss. The hall clock marking time. But the house no longer seemed to cooperate with denial. That afternoon, Miss Harcourt walked into the village. She moved slowly along the lane, as she always had, greeting neighbors with gentle politeness. She did not announce what had been done. She did not carry the story as gossip. Yet the village had its own way of sensing changes. At the post office, a woman leaned closer and said, "I heard Mr. Avery has been going to the old Harcourt house." Miss Harcourt smiled mildly. "He has business there. Anything troubling?" Miss Harcourt considered. "Only what has been troubling for a long time." The woman frowned. "People say that room is haunted." Miss Harcourt replied, "Rooms are only haunted by what people refuse to acknowledge." She left the post office and continued on her way. The air was colder now. The mist had thinned. The sun sat behind clouds like a patient eye. When she returned home late in the afternoon, she climbed the stairs once more. Habit. Not old habit. New habit. She opened the Victorian room door fully and stepped inside. The room was warm. That surprised her. Not physically warm, though the light helped, but warm in another sense. The warmth of a place that no longer had to hold its breath. She sat at the desk and opened one of Clara's final letters. Clara wrote of a resolve she had reached. "If they insist I am confused," she wrote, "then I must write more clearly. If they insist I forget, then I must remember harder." Miss Harcourt read the words and felt her admiration settle like calm. Clara had not been weak. She had been isolated. The room preserved her like a fragile ornament, because it benefited those who wished to call her fragile. Miss Harcourt replaced the letter. She stood and moved the chair closer to the window, not to hide, but to sit in light. Outside, the village moved quietly. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked once, and then fell silent. A distant cart rolled along the road. Miss Harcourt looked back at the curtains, and then she did something simple that felt deeply symbolic. She tied them back more neatly than they had ever been tied before. Not closed. Open. Restoration did not mean returning the house to what it had been. It meant allowing it to become what it should have been all along. That truth unfolded in the days that followed as naturally as the slow turning of seasons. Mr. Bell began to speak of Edith without flinching. At first it was tentative, a name introduced like a stranger. Then gradually it became part of conversation, as though the house was relearning its own family. Mrs. Lane stopped waiting for permission to open doors. She moved through rooms with quieter confidence. The Victorian room was now dusted like any other room, but she never did it with haste. She did it with respect. Not the respect of fear, but the respect of recognition. Mr. Avery returned with updates. Legal confirmations. Polite replies from solicitors. A note that some funds could be redirected to a small charity Edith had once supported. Not as payment, not as apology, but as alignment with what should have been. One evening, Mr. Bell stood at the dining table with an envelope in his hand. "I have written to the Historical Society," he said. Miss Harcourt looked up. "For what purpose?" "To correct the local record," he replied. "Clara is remembered as delicate and confused. Edith is barely mentioned at all. I want their names to appear properly." Mrs. Lane's eyes filled. "Will they listen?" Mr. Bell said, "They will if I insist." Miss Harcourt nodded. Insistence is sometimes the only tool left when gentleness has been used against you. A week later, a small gathering took place in the sitting room. Not a public event, not a grand ceremony. Simply a meeting with two women from the village society and one elderly man who kept parish notes. They sat with notebooks on their knees. Their expressions were politely curious. Mr. Bell spoke first. He did not dramatize. He did not confess loudly. He explained simply. "There was a misconception," he said. "One that suited my family for a long time. It does not suit truth." One woman frowned. "You mean the room?" Mr. Bell nodded. The room. And what it represented. Miss Harcourt watched their faces as he spoke. Shock was not their primary reaction. It was discomfort, the kind that came when a familiar story was removed, and something sharper appeared beneath. The elderly man cleared his throat. People prefer neat histories. Miss Harcourt spoke then, gently. Neat histories are often cleaned by removing the inconvenient pieces. The man nodded slowly as though conceding a truth he had always known, but seldom stated. They took notes. They asked careful questions. They did not accuse. They did not praise. They simply listened. When they left, the house felt quieter. Not with tension, with completion. That evening, Mr. Bell went to the Victorian Room and brought something down. A small music box. He placed it on the mantel and turned the key. A thin melody emerged, slightly uneven with age. "I remember this," he said quietly. "I remember Clara playing it." Mrs. Lane sat down abruptly. "I have never heard it." Mr. Bell looked at her. "Because it was locked away with the room. He let the melody play until it stopped." Miss Harcourt watched him. "You are learning," she said softly. He nodded. "I feel foolish," Miss Harcourt replied. "It is not foolish to be raised in a silence you did not choose. It becomes foolish only when you refuse to leave it." Mr. Bell's eyes remained on the music box. "I thought I was preserving dignity. But I was preserving a lie," Miss Harcourt said. "The lie was preserved long before you understood it. You are the one ending it." In the days that followed, the Victorian Room was transformed carefully, without disrespect. The bed remained, but the coverlet was replaced with one that could be used. The wardrobe was emptied of garments that could not breathe, and the dresses were stored properly elsewhere. The desk remained, but its drawers were opened and filled with ordinary paper and pens. It was still a Victorian room in spirit, but it was no longer a shrine. It was a room. One afternoon, Mrs. Lane entered holding fresh flowers. "I thought," she said hesitantly, "that perhaps it might like this." Miss Harcourt smiled. "It will." Mrs. Lane placed the flowers on the desk near the letters and photographs. Light fell over them. The room looked peaceful, not arranged peace. Real peace. Mr. Avery came by one last time before returning fully to his own duties. "It is settled," he said. "The correction stands. The record is filed. It cannot be easily undone," Mr. Bell nodded. "Thank you." Mr. Avery looked at Miss Harcourt. "And you, miss?" "Thank you." Miss Harcourt replied, "Truth often waits for someone to treat it gently enough to come out." Mr. Avery smiled faintly. Then his expression grew thoughtful. "There is one more thing." Mr. Bell's face tightened. "What?" Mr. Avery said, "There was a rumor about Edith after she left. That she went to London. That she married. That she died young. I found a note suggesting something else." Miss Harcourt's attention sharpened. "What else?" Mr. Avery said that she lived quietly in a seaside town under her own name. That she worked. That she wrote. That she was not destroyed. Miss Harcourt felt the story settle into its final shape. Not tragedy piled upon tragedy, but quiet survival. Mr. Bell's voice was rough. "Can we know where?" Mr. Avery replied. "Possibly. It would take time to confirm. But it is enough to know that the house did not end her." Mr. Bell nodded as if he had been granted a mercy he did not expect. That night, Miss Harcourt returned to the Victorian Room for the last time as its guardian. She stood in the doorway and looked at what it had become. Open curtains. Fresh flowers. Letters no longer hidden. Photographs no longer denied. A desk that could be used. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw Clara writing by the window, not in despair now, but in determination. She saw Edith leaving, not defeated but resolved. The room no longer felt like a warning. It felt like an apology made visible. Miss Harcourt stepped inside, crossed to the window, and opened it fully. Cold air rushed in. Clean. Sharp. Real. She let it move through the room and carry away whatever stale obedience remained. Then she whispered, not as performance, but as simple statement. You are seen. She closed the window gently and turned toward the door. Downstairs, the house continued. Tea would be made tomorrow. Curtains would be opened. Life would proceed. But not in the old way. In a new way where silence was no longer a rule. Where memory was allowed to be accurate. Where the Victorian Room was not a cage, just a room in a living house, finally released from the duty of hiding what should never have been hidden at all. The house on Elderwood Lane settled into its days with a quiet confidence it had never known before. Doors were opened without hesitation. Curtains were drawn back without fear. The rooms no longer waited for permission to breathe. The Victorian Room became part of the house rather than its secret. Sunlight crossed its floor each morning. Flowers were replaced when they wilted. Papers were written there again, not to persuade or defend, but simply to record ordinary thoughts. Nothing in the room demanded reverence anymore. It offered peace instead. Miss Eleanor Harcourt remained for a time, as she always had, moving gently through the house with watchful calm. She did not speak often of what had changed, because she understood that true resolution did not need repeating. It only needed maintaining. Mr. Bell learned to live with names spoken aloud. Clara. Edith. Their stories were no longer arranged to suit comfort. They were allowed to be complex, and therefore real. That knowledge did not trouble the house. It steadied it. When Miss Harcourt finally left, the Victorian Room stood open behind her. Not preserved, not protected, simply present. And in that quiet presence, the house learned something lasting. Silence had once ruled through habit. Now truth remained through choice. The room had stopped remembering for others. It remembered honestly. And that was enough.